Recently, it feels like Asian influence, or more specifically, East Asian influence, has become more prevalent than ever before. You have the Korean wave starting from the 1990s that has just reached astronomical heights recently with the popularity of K-pop, as well as achieving historical wins and having record-breaking series. You have Japan, well known and loved for the anime they create, and the constant, understandable romanticizing of life there. And you have China. You have jokes about the CCP, about the social credit system, and copy-pasters on the Tiananmen massacre. So, what's the deal with China? To kind of tackle why Japan and Korea are getting all the clout and China's getting memed instead, we kind of have to introduce the idea of soft power. Essentially, this term was first coined by Joseph Nye in the 1980s, and it's all about influencing other countries, but not with economic or military might. So if it's not about how much cash you have or how much guns you possess, then what is it really? Well, it's made up of three factors, being your cultural attractiveness, foreign policy, and political ideals. But today what I really want to focus on is cultural attractiveness. And I think we already know where this is going. In the opening montage earlier, we saw that Korea and Japan are absolutely killing it in terms of exporting their culture overseas and gaining millions of fans worldwide. Just earlier this year, Squid Game became the most watched series ever on Netflix, and Parasite was the first Asian film to win the original screenplay Oscar. BTS, the top boy band in the world, brings more than $5 billion into the economy annually. And we've probably heard of all these feats and more, but what does this actually mean? How do all these celebrated feats translate back into soft power? A study done by the Pew Research Center in 2020 shows that 77% of Americans have a favorable impression of South Korea, and this is up from 31% in 2003. This favorable impression that Americans currently hold for South Korea is much higher than the impression they have for traditional allies like the UK at 57%, or for other allies like Australia and France. And not only this, but having a more favorable impression of a country and seeing them in a good light and as a trustworthy friend also makes political alliances easier and more durable as well. The impact of being able to export your culture so successfully can also be seen through another interesting statistic, which is the amount of international students which want to go to a country for exchange. Let's take a look at South Korea, for example. In 2019, more than 160,000 students went overseas to South Korea to study abroad. This is a much higher number than comparing to 2003, where only 12,000 students went abroad. This is also pre-pandemic back in 2019, before all of those milestone achieving records we mentioned earlier were set. So we can only imagine what the numbers might be like now. And this showcases the strength of soft power and in creating successful cultural exports, because it allows people to foster an appreciation of your culture, a curiosity of wanting to go over there and kind of experience what it's like for themselves, and it also allows them, foreigners, to bring back a favorable impression of the place they visited back into their home country and to continue spreading that favorable impression. Overall, it has a huge impact. It's great for allowing people to catch a glimpse of your culture and to really like you, to stop seeing you as perhaps a foreign country and to develop a favorable impression of you, which, as we already said, is very useful for not only just in society, but also in the political landscape as well. So soft power is something that is very important, perhaps now more than ever before, because in an age where war is condemned, soft power is now the weapon of choice. China's soft power does not come from cultural attractiveness. It comes from economic might. It comes from having a market of 1.4 billion people, and it comes from coercion and payment. Other countries fall in line not because they appreciate China's culture, not saying there's nothing to appreciate, but that definitely is not the top of mind case here. It comes more so because they don't want to be shut out of that lucrative market, and to enter that market you must comply to what the government demands. We can see this in a lot of cases where a lot of foreign companies, ones that we've definitely all heard of, falls in line with some of China's demands, and most of this comes from territorial concerns. All these companies that you see here have either stayed silent on a controversial issue or have spoken out and rectified a mistake that they've made in regards to a territorial issue. Often, this concerns labeling Hong Kong or Taiwan as an independent country instead of as belonging to China. And to the Chinese government, this is a mistake which must be rectified, or else the company gets shut out of that lucrative market of 1.4 billion people. These are just companies which have fallen in line, but there's probably an incident that is very top of mind for me in terms of a whole organization or a whole league actively going back on its word. Specifically, I'm thinking about the NBA here. The NBA has tried for decades to cultivate popularity in China and to export the sport to China because of how big the market was. However, when the Hong Kong protests started, the general manager of the Houston Rockets team posted a simple tweet with 7 words: "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." This tweet would spell out a PR disaster for the NBA, and the reaction from the Chinese government was swift. Immediately, preseason games that were being broadcasted to 500 million people were banned, and fans were considering boycotting some of the live games that were being held in Shenzhen and Shanghai. So all of these incidents currently summarize China's interaction with the Western world and how other countries may perceive China. None of this is soft power, by the way. It's just China flexing its economic might, and if anyone talks smack, they're gonna respond with economic action. All this raises the question, where is China's soft power? Unlike its East Asian neighbors of Korea and Japan, which are successfully exporting their culture, China seems to really be struggling in this area. So is it because China doesn't have any soft power, or perhaps they just aren't seeing it as a priority? Well, the answer is complicated, as most things are. First off, China definitely does recognize the significance of soft power. In 2007, former President Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress that China needed to focus more on soft power and invest more in it. And they are investing $10 billion a year. But where does all of that go, and why aren't we seeing anything come out of it? A major reason why all of China's efforts and investments haven't really been converting into anything is because China's political ideologies actively undermine its influence in soft power. So what I mean by this is evidently China wants to cultivate more soft power, but literally the way that China is run and its state and its kind of like ideologies, all of that actively curb the amount of soft power potential that it could have. This is the major reason why China may not have realized its full soft power potential. It's not that China doesn't have anything to show, but it's because everything that has to be shown goes through a censorship and propaganda authority that filters out for anything that could be seen as detrimental to the state. And so everything that goes through that is processed, and what comes out is heavily filtered and propagandized messages that obviously won't strike a chord. Here's an example of something that the China government has produced in an effort to make China appear better and to gain soft power.
You're probably also confused about a situation in Taiwan and who the relationships between it and the mainland. Actually, for normal citizens, we just want us to be united as one, because we think we're from one family the same.
This is China, we love the culture, we're the trend phenomenon, the red dragon and the evil, but a peaceful place, the beautiful land, where rich culture remains.
So other than what the government is pushing out, what else is being produced in China? Surely we have cat videos or a story that someone has written and thinks is really cool. Those are things produced by ordinary people. And this is content that isn't necessarily affiliated with the government. Well, this is another major problem of the whole censorship structure. Because of how the censorship structure works, a lot of it stifles the creativity that is thriving in the country. Because all messaging must align with the political ideology of the state, what usually happens is the original story or any main points that disagree with this official ideology will be changed, and that obviously will also alter the whole story or the messaging of the initial work. If you're going to take out and forcibly insert pieces that don't really belong in an original story or art piece, what you're doing isn't preserving the integrity of the work. You're just diluting what would have been a really good story or piece, and that isn't going to have the same effect when it's exported overseas or even to a domestic audience. I also just wanted to quickly mention that China does have a source of soft power which historically has been really strong. This has traditionally been in arts, painting, poetry, calligraphy, ceramics, and so much more. This is culture that doesn't belong to the Chinese Communist Party. This is culture that spans for millenniums. And this is traditional Chinese culture, which historically has held a lot of attractiveness to foreigners and isn't affiliated with any political party's ideologies. And I have a few more examples which are more based in our modern space, but they're perhaps going to be more niche. So an example that I can think of right now is Douyin makeup, which has been trending a lot on TikTok, and often it will show the style of makeup that is trending in China and that is being shared on Douyin, which is the equivalent platform of TikTok in China. And yeah, this has been on my For You page a lot, and I feel like a lot of people know what the term Douyin makeup means and what kind of style it's referring to. Again, this is an expression of creativity. This is a makeup style. It has nothing to do with like the state's political ideologies, and because of that, it feels authentic. People who enjoy makeup can really connect and be like, hey, that's a really cool makeup style. I want to try that too. And they start to appreciate the kind of style that evolved out of China, and they get a little bit of a glimpse into perhaps Chinese culture, how makeup is evolving over there, and how people are wearing makeup there. So that is something that I think is coming out of China that isn't affiliated with memes that people generally seem to really like. And I think that's a cool representation of China that has come through that people can connect about. Another example that I have is the popularity of Genshin. And this one is a bit interesting because the first time I saw it, I was like, wait, this is a Chinese game? Because it just sounds kind of Japanese to me. And I guess this makes sense because Chinese game studios aren't as well revered as Japanese game studios, but it's an interesting marketing choice nonetheless. So that's another example I thought of something that's produced in China that has had an impact in terms of Western popular culture, although this one's more specific to gaming. And then finally, I also thought of this other example, which is on a very popular novel that has been adapted into a live action, and its name is 魔道祖师, or The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation. Now, this is a novel that features a same-sex relationship between two males, which obviously goes against the official political ideology of the Chinese government. And because of that, when it was adapted into a live action, the trope went from like actual romantic love interests to fated homies that were just like purely platonic, but they would kind of do everything for each other, and they were like, it was crazy. And that was the official storyline that was put out when the live drama happened. So that is kind of like an example of chopping and changing what is pretty essential to the original spirit of the work and kind of forcing it to fit your political ideology, because then when you export it, that's not what the story is about, and it kind of dulls and cheapens a lot of the impact that the original novel would have had. So this again all goes back to the point, which is China itself is actually stifling a lot of its soft power or the potential that it could have. Instead of letting the creativity of its people run free and express what they want to express, everything goes through that censorship structure, and because of that, all the messaging that comes out has to fit the political narrative, and then you get certain ideas that are watered down or changed completely, and it no longer carries the impact it would have had. And to put into perspective of how censorship can really ruin the spirit of a work, imagine the ending of Fight Club being changed. Except that really happened in China, and it's not just a one-time thing. So imagine being Chinese, wanting to create a work, and having your vision chopped and changed, and then exported as a CCP-approved message. The government is really limiting the creativity of their people. There is also another interesting internal struggle within China, which I'll just briefly mention here, and it's the fact that China desperately wants to kind of export its soft power and showcase its culture, but at the same time, it really does not want to be influenced by Western countries. Because of the ideological clashes between the West and China, if China opens its gates too fully and allows people to be influenced by Western ideals, that could lead to political and societal instability, and China definitely does not want that. But at the same time, how are you going to show other people a glimpse of your own culture if you're censoring it? So yeah, China is definitely stuck in a tough spot because they want to relax their restrictions more in order to export their culture, but at the same time, they really don't want to be influenced by the West. Now in this part of the video, I wanted to respond to some of the comments that you guys left in my first TikTok video. Essentially, for people who haven't seen it, I posted a video that briefly outlines what soft power is and expressed the idea that China does have a soft power deficiency, and this manifests in the differences of perceptions between China and Korea and Japan. I actually received so many comments underneath in which everyone kind of expressed their own opinions on why there was this soft power deficiency. So yeah, I just wanted to respond to some of them because they are all really insightful and interesting. So I looked through all the comments and I can probably categorize them in three main categories. First is people's kind of own personal experiences on how this difference in treatment has manifested in their lives, or just things that they've come across while browsing social media. The second is kind of on that topic again of China limiting itself and not being able to express perhaps its full potential of soft power. And the third are various comments that talk about geopolitics, which is an interesting one, and I'll get into that for sure. So first we have some personal experiences. I'm going to read this username off the screen because I can't remember the numbers, but user 1831551519870 talks about how any mention of China or any depiction of China's culture immediately leads to like a comment that is perhaps not the most relevant, that talks about the Chinese government or perhaps some policies they might have enacted that are seen as quite controversial. And I feel like this is sadly quite a common occurrence when it comes to, you know, a video that's just talking about Chinese culture or sharing something about China. There's always going to be like a joke about social credit. I don't want to go into too much depth on this point, but the whole reason why I do mention it is because this whole video we've been talking about China's soft power deficiency in a very big picture lens. We're talking about reasons why it might have this deficiency, we're talking about cultural attractiveness, so on and so forth. But it's easy to forget that this kind of situation and this climate actually has a real impact on individuals as well. It means that if you're Chinese and you're seeing a video that represents your culture, every time you open the comments, there's going to be some snarky negative remark on the government that has nothing to do with the video. And honestly, that really sucks. And what another user with the username hashtag has pointed out is that the opposite is also actually true. And I've definitely seen this as well, but it's a really good point. So this user hashtag actually mentions another popular social media app in China, which is called Xiaohongshu. And essentially this is like Chinese Pinterest. So a lot of really pretty pictures gets shared on there, and like it's more than just pretty pictures, but you kind of get the gist. And what's happening now is that because a lot of this content that is made in China is aligned with, I guess, what's trendy now, people are reposting this content, but they're not labeling it as Chinese content. They're kind of rebranding it as Korean makeup or Korean fashion when the creators are literally Chinese. As this user hashtag points out, a lot of it definitely is because when you label something as Korean makeup, it probably gathers more interest and more views. But what's interesting to think about is the kind of preconception or the kind of image we tie to certain phrases or certain words. So then moving on to the next big category of comments, which is talking about how China is limiting its own soft power through censorship and through not being able to express its full creativity. I'm just going to be reading out one of these comments, and this is by user 5039946366611. So what they said is, mainland Chinese cannot access the world because CCP blocked them. Korean and Japanese can access to all and show the world their cultures, which is also a really good point. And this definitely goes back to the idea that one of the biggest limitations that is placed on China's soft power is China itself. China has been blocking a lot of Western websites since like the beginning of time. So a lot of Chinese citizens actually don't have access to like Instagram or TikTok. And the reason why I bring up these two platforms is because these two platforms run off user-generated content, and they're probably the most relevant right now in our social media world. As we mentioned earlier, any official messaging that goes to the government is kind of just inauthentic, and it just doesn't hit for anyone because we can smell the ulterior motive from a mile away. But user-generated content, this is different because it shows a more authentic side to someone's life or something they created or something they just want to share. And this isn't riddled by political ideologies or a particular message that the state probably wants to promote. And because of that lack in seeing kind of what the average Chinese citizen poses and being able to see the country not as just the government but as people, I think that kind of lack of understanding makes it easy for people to just form a perception of a whole country, especially when the only source of communication is kind of through the government and it's through what they want you to see and through pushing messages with obvious political beliefs behind it. And lastly, we have comments on geopolitics, which I mentioned earlier. All I have to say to these comments is, yes, geopolitics plays an undeniable role in how the Western world sees China. It is literally in the US's interest to present China in a more unfavorable light. So geopolitics is absolutely crucial to the discussion of our perception of China in the Western world. However, this video is based on soft power, and so my focus here is really on cultural attractiveness. But yes, it has a very, very big impact if you're looking at the subject matter more holistically. So that was a really good discussion. I read through all of the comments that you guys left on my TikToks. I just felt like there were so many good, insightful comments and different personal experiences that were being shared, and I really loved reading the comments underneath. Everything I've referenced in this video, all the academic papers and articles and even the TikTok that I posted, I will link them in the description below if you want to read more on this subject. I highly advise you to read further on it if you're interested in this topic. Literally, I just summarized like all the key points through these articles, so you'll definitely get a much better understanding of it if you read the sources itself. And if you have any experiences, feel free to share that in the comments below. Before I finish this video though, I wanted to read to you a paragraph written by David Shambaugh in his academic paper which he published in the Journal of Foreign Affairs. Here he summarizes why there is a disconnect between China's heavy investments and their meager returns. Why the disconnect? The answer is that the Chinese government approaches public diplomacy the same way it constructs high-speed rail or builds infrastructure, by investing money and expecting to see development. What China fails to understand is that despite its world-class culture, cuisine, human capital, and despite its extraordinary economic rise over the last several decades, so long as its political system denies rather than enables free human development, its propaganda efforts will face an uphill battle. Soft power cannot be bought, it must be earned. And it is best earned when a society's talented citizens are allowed to interact directly with the world rather than being controlled by the authorities. For China, that would mean loosening draconian restraints at home and reducing efforts to control opinion abroad. Only then could the country tap into its enormous reserves of unrealized soft power. I hope you found this video helpful and thought-provoking. In my next video, I'll be looking into different depictions of Chinese masculinity, most notably the Wen and Wu paradigms, in which it was shaped through fascinating historical context and how that's kind of culminated into modern-day culture. So if this appeals to you, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!